Most chicks are using like 5 milligrams of Anavar, 2.5 to 5 milligrams of Anavar, and then they're given a 50 milligram A-bomb. Like, what do you expect them to do with it? What's up, guys? Derek, moreplates.com. Today we're going to be talking about Kristen Nun. So this is a chick with a great physique. She is somebody who is highly speculated as to if she's natural or not. And I basically got called out into doing a natty or not by her, sort of thing. So there's this post she made September 27th, caption, "Never underestimate me, ... that'll be fun." Guy comments, "Never underestimate test," in all caps. And you can't see it on the desktop version, but this is she pinned the comment, and she actually seems to do this a lot, where anything, even if somebody says something negative, if she thinks that you know, I don't know, if she wants to fuck with the person, she'll like pin it or whatever. But anyways, I got tagged by some people in this thread. So basically, she says, "I do not use test or other injectable compounds." Somebody tags me, LOL. So I see this. Somebody never underestimate stupid, blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Then she says, "Hope he makes a video. I stand on the fact I do not and have never used injectable compounds." And then she tags me. And then there's, you know, more threads in here about some stuff. People trying to argue about her femininity and what kind of compound she's used and whatnot. I stand on the fact I've never used testosterone or any other injectable steroids. And this guy's saying, "So then you're saying you're natural, question mark? Either you take steroids or you eat. There's only two things you can do. So why would you say you're not natural? Either you take steroids or you eat. There's only two things you can do." Well, thank you for showing you have no knowledge or understanding of bodybuilding. First off, there's a huge list of compounds that aren't injectable steroids. Second, I'm not that large. I don't need a ton of gear to be ripped at 130 pounds. Lastly, even when using steroids, it requires proper nutrition to see results. It's not an option to either eat or take gear like you stated. So basically, she's admitting she's not natural, but is it saying she hasn't used test or injectable compounds? And that's basically trolling the guy who said never underestimate test. She says she's never used test, which is a fair enough statement, because, you know, there are a ton of things you could take that are not injectable. There's a lot of things that are oral. There are a lot of things that, even sublingual, which is, I guess, technically oral. But I mean, at the end of the day, like, there's a lot of orally ingested agents that could otherwise facilitate significant amounts of muscle growth. And if you look at this chick's physique, you go through her page, she has a better physique than most dudes, to be honest. Like, even better than guys on gear. The reason is her insertions, though, are quite good. Like, obviously, if she only weighs 130 pounds, I guess proportionally for her height, that's why it makes sense and why she looks so big in person. You know, if you're the average height guy, like, you would tower this chick, but proportionally, like, her inserts are very good. She has enough muscle on her frame that she looks massive muscularity wise for her size, or height, I should say. So she weighs 130 pounds and is easily one of the I don't know, like, one of the most speculated females in terms of what she takes, what she doesn't take. And in the comment section, it's always like the first comment, "Kristen, can you tell me what anabolic compounds do you use?" Let's see what else. Let's go to here. Here she is doing a hammer strength row machine here. Let's see. Blah, 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 blah. Bet you put the guy to shame beside you. Haha, good job. But anyway, so a lot of people are speculating about her hormone use, what she takes. So she's basically just inviting me to do my own video on it. And that's what we're going to be getting into. So what would you use if you weren't injecting? So I did a video previously on the most well-tolerated anabolic agents in females. And I kind of touched on Anavar, Primo, Nandrolone, and kind of elaborated on the endogenous steroidogenesis pathways and what would lead to a increased level of nandrolone production in females, and how it's sort of just a justification for certain choices, or outlining why certain compounds would make more sense for a female to deploy in an AAS context. But one thing I should own in on is the fact that 99.9% of chicks in the fitness industry, if you're not competing at like an open bodybuilding level, the likelihood that you're going to need to even inject anything as a female is probably low, to be honest. So I kind of wanted to get into, like, first of all, she says she doesn't inject anything, and that's kind of like the last thing you would ever want to do as a female is get to the point where you're using anabolic androgenic steroids to begin with. So presumably she's leveraging everything she can, just short of, like, you know, going the full distance, and she's probably ending her use at something as intense as Anavar, realistically. Like, I highly doubt she's going to be using oral primo. Above and beyond that would, you know, nandrolone, it's not like there's an orally bioavailable version of it. And like, what are you left with? Like, realistically, I don't think she's like digging into the pharmacology of this shit. So realistically, she's probably deferring to the go-to, you know, tried and true compound choice for all women, which is Anavar at a reasonable dose that is not masculinizing, which is pretty fucking low to begin with. So she's probably being relatively conservative with her dosage choices, because anybody who's using Anavar even for a reasonable duration of exposure at an even what a guy would consider a very mild dose would still cause levels of masculinization in most women. So my guess, first of all, before I get into, you know, step-by-step progression, I kind of want to make this video an educational segment on PEDs in women, because my last one was kind of brief, and kind of jump to the extreme end of the spectrum of women using AAS rather than elaborating on the things that 99.9% of women would probably benefit from researching further before they even delve into that extreme of, you know, territory. So for her, I don't think it gets more extreme than Anavar personally, and at her weight, I think it's reasonable to expect that that might be true, that she hasn't injected anything in her life. And she even showed it like a test result a while ago. This was her blood test result showing her total testosterone and her free testosterone, showing how her total test is on the bottom end of the reference range essentially, and her free test is right in the middle. This does not prove anything, obviously, because you could just come off what you're using for this test, or like it could otherwise just be showing that you're like relatively suppressed if you have low total testosterone levels because of something else you're using exogenously. I don't know if her reasoning for posting this back in the day was to actually claim natural, or if it was just to say she's not on testosterone. But either way, I believe that she is not injecting testosterone. That's fine. It doesn't really, obviously this test doesn't really mean shit, because you could clear it out of your system in time, but I just, you know, I would believe her that she's not using that. So I assume her use goes as far as Anavar, and I would imagine dosages not exceeding even like 10 milligrams, and duration of exposure probably relatively short, to because she does not seem to have a significant masculinization to the point where you would, you know, think, okay, this chick like really needs to pull things back. Because like obviously when you look at her physique, there are a lot of guys who are going to be like, whoa, like way too much, bro. But it's like, there's a difference between like a developed, like jacked physique and a chick whose face is like visibly masculinized, like beyond the point of no return. You know what I mean? So with her, maybe I should listen to a clip of what her voice sounds like before I make any comments, but let's see if there is any here. I'm going to play a couple of videos. These all look like lifting footage though. It's not like there's any interviews. Anyways, the physique itself, like realistically, I think it's plausible that it could be a myriad of compounds that are not injectable, and Anavar probably being the sole anabolic androgenic steroid that she leverages for hypertrophy and offsetting catabolism in whatever scenario she puts herself in. Looking at the other aspects, you have to consider there's also growth hormone, insulin. There's other things you can do as a female. The likelihood that she's deploying insulin probably low as fuck. Growth hormone, wouldn't be surprised if maybe that's in the picture. And Anavar, probably reasonable to expect that that's the compound she's using. As far as step-by-step progression of what makes the most sense, in my opinion, before you get to Anavar though, that's partially what I wanted to do in this video. Well, it's actually the main thing I want to do in this video. So obviously she has a great physique. We've established she's not natural. And I would presume that she can probably get to where she was with good genetics and oral only compounds. And if her dosage of Anavar was super low, the duration of exposure could be extended as well, a bit longer potentially, you know, 2.5 to 5 milligrams. Maybe she'd, can stretch your use out for the months as opposed to just a handful of weeks, whereas you might only be able to get away with a handful of weeks if you're using a higher dose. But the step-by-step progression, girls should be using things like creatine off the bat, no brainer. Things like L-Carnitine, like injectable L-Carnitine. I doubt a lot of girls are doing that, but it is certainly something natural that you could leverage to increase androgen receptor density and improve your body composition significantly, increase fat loss and increase muscle mass. It's kind of like a no-brainer thing to be using if you can handle the volume of pinning. Some people will use oral, but at that point you're introducing a significant amount of TMAO into your system, which is very carcinogenic. So I would advise probably only using it sporadically. I'm actually coming out with a carnitine product just for this purpose, for the sake of convenience, but I also have injectable L-Carnitine available through my HRT clinic, which is the main thing I would recommend people use. And only using L-Carnitine when it's like a huge hassle where you don't have time to do your shot that day. So creatine monohydrate, obvious no-brainer. Carnitine, ideally injectable, would be the next thing because you bypass that metabolism and, or I should say digestion, where you end up creating TMAO in the gut. Next thing is something that is often overlooked is the effective low-dose Clen, which is something that is becoming more and more mainstream among women. And the reason for that is because of its ability to induce mTOR phosphorylation, which at a very low dose can induce a significant hypertrophic response in females. And if you're using a low enough dose, you can get away with a long duration of exposure without having really any deleterious outcomes. Like, you have to consider this was a clinically approved treatment at dosages much higher than would otherwise be needed to yield muscle growth. So a lot of women are actually deploying this in a very, very low dose context for not only offsetting catabolism, but inducing hypertrophy and enhancing, like I said, mTOR phosphorylation in skeletal muscle is enhanced at this dosage at a low dosage and can be, leveraged for a fairly long duration without seemingly any issues for the majority of women. I'm not saying to do this, but I've seen 10 to 20 micrograms be used for quite a long time without any, adverse events occurring, and it seems relatively well tolerated. And compared to the clinical literature using dosages much higher than this, it seems like a reasonable approach to take that is non-androgenic related. So that is another thing I see often. It's leveraging the beta-2 adrenergic pathway, which is something that you could otherwise target with other compounds, potentially more novel treatments that are not really explored. Clen is just kind of like the go-to beta-2 adrenergic agonist that most people are aware of and have access to, so that's the one they leverage. There's different ones that are probably more selective in their nature, that are more optimal for the same outcomes with a relative lack of interaction with, or resulting in, potential outcomes that may be otherwise undesired, because Clen is obviously not safe necessarily. It's just at this dose, it seems to be relatively well tolerated and safe based on just the years of use. It has a lot of years backing its use with a lot of anecdotal reports as well as a shit ton of clinical literature. So anyways, that's kind of the novel treatments is like a whole nother video in itself. And frankly, it's a lot less explored. So it's probably not something that you want to mess with if you don't know what you're doing. And Clen is something that is well researched and is something that it seems like a lot of women are starting to kind of like incorporate into their routines that have coaches who kind of know what they're talking about. Next thing is Ecdysteroids. So these are things like ecdysterone and terkesterone. These are things people have actually asked me to cover in videos. This is because they are, they're not like tissue selective anabolics necessarily, but they more so work via their interaction with estrogen receptors rather than binding to the AR, and they exert their effects without really inducing any androgenic effects. So even though they're not like tissue selective Sarms or anything like that, they seem to be free of androgenicity and well tolerated by females and produce like relatively decent outcomes. Like some people have reported gaining, like a handful of pounds of muscle using a high dose of ecdysterone or using a high dose of terkesterone. So this is something that's definitely worth evaluating because it is still available over the counter and seems pretty well tolerated to date with a relative lack of side effects. And this is something I'm exploring for My own company, I am getting a testosterone product launched soon, and I'm actually excited for it because it's like very few things that I can look at personally that actually do anything that don't cause hair loss, that don't cause significant androgenic outcomes, and are legal still. So this is something I'm exploring personally, and there's also a certain way that we are putting it out that makes sure it is going to be, I don't want to leak too much information about it, but the basis of the product will be an ecdysteroid, but it will be formatted in a way that is going to be absorbed much better than the traditional random tub of powder of ecdysterone from some random company that doesn't really understand pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. So this is something that's going to be soon. It's been a long time coming. I've had this product on my to-do list for a long time, dug into a lot of the clinical literature to decide on if it was worth the large payment that came into getting the, I don't know, chemistry process to design this exact format that I need. Anyway, I'll do a separate video on that because a lot of people have been asking me about ecdysteroids, and I haven't really covered it, but that's something that would make a lot of sense for females to look at next. That's not anabolic androgenic steroids. Above and beyond that, PPAR delta agonists like cardarine. That is obviously something that is not an anabolic androgenic steroid either, but can still have positive outcomes on body composition and performance. So, obviously there is, concern about carcinogenic activity in the body when you use it, but yeah, with that being said, it still produces outcomes. So I'm going to mention it. I'm not going to say you should be using it. I'm just saying that it is certainly something that is being leveraged by females currently to achieve body composition outcomes with a relative lack of androgenic activity because it simply does not interact with that pathway whatsoever. Above and beyond that, you have Sarms, things like Osterine for short bursts. The only problem with Sarms is they crush SHBG levels, so they can probably only be leveraged in a short-term context without driving SHBG into the ground. Well, I guess it depends on the dosage again and the duration of exposure, but SHBG is certainly something to keep an eye on, especially with females when they are using a low dose that's not like shutting them down necessarily, but is creating an environment where SHBG is lower and sort of frees up a lot of DHT and testosterone that would have otherwise been bound up and creates a more hyper androgen dominant environment potentially. So it's not the Osterine that's inherently androgenic or any of the Sarms, rather it is, well, some of them are, but I mean, it also enhances the androgenicity of the endogenous hormones you already produce naturally because it is less SHBG to regulate how much is getting to tissues. You have more DHT and testosterone flying around your body that would have otherwise been bound up by SHBG and like rendered inactive essentially. So this is why SHBG is so much higher in females than males, because it regulates androgenic activity in the body and makes sure there is significantly more estrogen available to tissues than androgens, whereas for males it's kind of skewed a bit more in the opposite direction. And this is also why you have the binding affinity of DHT is like significantly higher for SHBG than testosterone, which is also significantly higher than estrogen for SHBG. So there's a reason for all things in the body and the way you have certain binding globulins that kind of determine ratios of things for certain reasons in each gender. What else could be looked at? So obviously growth hormone, like I mentioned as well, and insulin are things that are not traditional, androgens that are going to drive masculinization outcomes to the same extent. Growth hormone is something that obviously they have their inherent risks in themselves, and there is interaction again with insulin and SHBG and things like this, but they are certainly things being leveraged by females to kind of maximize as many vectors as possible of muscle growth without having to steer themselves towards going all the anabolics. Like the problem is a lot of these chicks that end up with negative outcomes are girls that are jumping headfirst into anabolic androgenic steroids and not doing any of the other shit they could do that does not have a risk of this stuff. Looking at basic shit like fucking L-Carnitine, creatine, stuff like that. It makes a lot of sense to kind of exhaust different resources and have like a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, things that are over the counter and actually produce like reasonable outcomes and don't carry any inherent risk. And aren't gonna fuck with your endocrine system. So like what the biggest mistake, like I said, is chicks who just like, they get into this, they're like, oh, I wanna build muscle and step on stage. I need to be on 10 milligrams of Anavar, like right off the bat, instead of looking at all these other pathways that probably could have, in cumulatively yielded a better physique than that giant dose, not a giant dose, but for a female, a pretty heavy dose of Anavar. And then maybe if you needed more above and beyond that, you might only need like a tiny fucking bit of actual anabolics at the end of the day. And when you get into the anabolics, obviously, you know, we can talk about the compounds that I mentioned in my previous video, the main ones that are deployed by females traditionally: Anavar, Primo, Nandrolone, not in conjunction with one another, but those are the ones that are the most tissue selective and kind of make the most sense for most of them. Above and beyond that, I guess there's arguments for very low dose Anadrol as well. That's pretty well tolerated in the clinical literature at dosages much higher than would otherwise be needed to yield significant muscle growth outcomes with a relative lack of androgenicity that gets a pretty bad rap because of its, you know, liver toxicity and its, you know, has a pretty, you know, ruthless sides, but it's often the dosage being deployed and people aren't really considering the minimum effective dosage. They just think, oh, like an A-bomb is 50 milligrams, so I need to be on that. And it's like, bro, most chicks are using like 5 milligrams of Anavar, 2.5 to 5 milligrams of Anavar, and then they're given a 50 milligram A-bomb. Like, what do you expect them to do with it? Cut it into fucking 20ths? You know what I mean? So it's like, to get a reasonable dose of Anadrol for a female, it's like, it's pretty hard, so I can see why it's not leveraged more, but I think there is utility to it potentially if it was in a format that could otherwise be divided into a much smaller dosage amount. And as well as Superdrol, that sort of fits into that category as well, where it could potentially make sense if it was formatted in a much smaller increment. It's just traditionally you're going to find these compounds sold in dosage formats that are simply not... I don't know, divided into, you know, little segments that could otherwise be used at a dosage that's safe for like having relatively low risk of masculinization in a short-term burst. But yeah, those are kind of the compounds that are mainly worth looking at. Like I've seen reports of women running, you know, like 2.5 milligrams of Anavar pretty long-term and having no, you know, masculinizing outcomes. But again, these are girls that are exhausting their resources of all the other non-androgenic outcomes first, and then icing on the cake if needed. If they're like a high-level competition athlete, they might throw in that for that purpose just because they couldn't otherwise, you know, at a high level, there's certain things that girls are going to do to win pro-level shows. And I'm not talking about open bodybuilding though, keep that in mind. At that point, it's kind of like, shit's kind of out the window in terms of trying to minimize. Like you can still take proactive measures to minimize, but I mean, like for talking about a physique like Kristen Nun, for example, you don't really need to go that far above and beyond, like into the injectables. You could probably stick with many of the things I said that weren't even exogenous androgen related that would yield a significant amount of benefit in a, you know, person with a good physique or good genetics, I should say. And then maybe you're going to have to dip into the very, very low risk anabolics at a reasonable, very, very low dosage that you would otherwise need a higher dose to yield the same body composition if you didn't know how to exhaust the other shit in the other more safe categories. As far as like choices too, you know, Anavar and Primo, the tissue selectivity of these compounds seems to vary in different tissues too. You have to keep in mind, like Nandrolone is one of the most well tolerated from a hair loss context. However, it doesn't mean that in a like voice changing context, it's not potentially worse than something like Anavar. It also depends on your previous SHBG levels kind of going into your use, how insulin resistant you are or not, what your SHBG levels are like before you go into using an oral steroid like Anavar. Things of this nature are things that need to be considered. And the tissue selectivity doesn't really, it kind of depends person to person. Some will tolerate Nandrolone better than Anavar. Some will not tolerate Nandrolone at all, even though it's like probably the most hair safe of the bunch. Like it's way better than Primo in that context, but Primo's also been well tolerated in women at dosages much higher than Nandrolone. Nandrolone has shown pretty poor outcomes as low as like, in a side effect context for masculinization, as low as like 50 milligrams every other week. So whereas Primo, you can find studies showing it up to 1,200 milligrams in women. It wasn't well tolerated by all of them, but it was like a significant chunk it was well tolerated by, which is pretty fucking interesting. Does that mean you could get away with it? No, it's gonna rip the hair out of even guys' heads at like Well, the dosage is half of that realistically, but in different tissues, like I said, it seems to be more favorable in certain contexts, and different compound selection is kind of individually dependent. And Anavar is sort of like a go-to for most women. Primo is also a go-to, and Nandrolone for some actually makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of like depends on the person and your pre-existing hormone profile and whatnot, and your genetic propensity as well to certain things, as well as your estrogen levels. But above and beyond that too, body composition outcomes like Anavar, you're going to be a lot drier, and Nandrolone, you're going to be less dry than Anavar. So, you know, some girls are just like not going to want that look that you would get from a volume driving compound like Nandrolone, even during an off season, and they would prefer something like Anavar, which seems to be more, aesthetics friendly, even in a muscle building context. So there's, things that play into that choice as well in terms of what to select and what not to select. So kind of getting a bit off track here, but at the end of the day, basically there's a lot of things that can be leveraged by females. And frankly, for 99% of them, you probably don't even need to look at the anabolic androgenic steroids. If you're not stepping on stage, it's very unlikely you're going to need these things to achieve the physique you want. If you're looking for a physique like Kristen Nun, you're probably going to have to dip into this category at least a little bit. I don't advise it, but it doesn't mean you can't leverage all these other things that are non-androgenic that you could otherwise get, 70 to 80% of the way there, and then use a very, very mild dose of the anabolics to kind of get you to that 100% mark without having to expose yourself to such a high dosage that you unnecessarily expose yourself to relatively high likelihood of masculinization outcomes. So she's done a good job of maintaining her femininity while dipping into the anabolics, and created a great physique. And she has a solid page. So if you're looking for, female motivation, then go check her page out. And that's what I think she's doing. I think she's probably going as far as Anavar if she's not injecting anything. I don't know how much of the other stuff she's using from the first compounds I mentioned that would otherwise reduce your necessity for dipping into the AAS section, but it's worth noting nonetheless. If you're a female, or if you are a guy who has a girlfriend who is competing or whatever, and or if know a chick who has a coach who has her on ridiculous shit like fucking Trenbolone and fucking Winstrol and all this other shit, or testosterone, not in a HRT context, by the way, because in menopausal women, using TRT replacement is not actually far-fetched. It's actually quite a reasonable thing to do at a reasonable dosage, but that's besides the point. That's a whole nother video. At the end of the day, don't fuck chicks up by giving out ridiculous protocols, and be wary of how low their tolerance is to androgens, because it is very low, to the point that it's very unlikely you should even need to dip into this side of the equation unless you have like very high body composition goals similar to Kristen Nun or beyond. So anyways, take from that what you will. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplates.com. If you want more deep dives into bodybuilding pharmacology, you can sign up to the newsletter. It's the first link in the description below. You're not going to get sent my articles if you don't sign up for that. So a lot of incentive to do so, because I have far better information in my articles, to be honest. It's all broken down into concise subsections with table of contents and hyperlinks to all of the clinical studies I reference for you to dig into yourself for your own personal research if you care to. If you want to check out my social media platforms, at moreplates_moredates is my Instagram. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Snapchat, I'm on BitChute, I'm on Twitter, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Apple Podcasts. Frankly, the content's pretty much exactly the fucking same on all of them, but some people like other platforms better than others, like Apple Podcasts. If you want to listen instead of watch and not burn through your data at the gym or driving or whatever, then, it's obviously better than ripping through your data on YouTube. If you want to support the channel, you can check out anything I am associated with in the video description below. My TRT clinic, as well as Gorilla Mind, Gorilla Mode, my turnkey pre-workout formulas that I designed from scratch myself using only the highest efficacious dosages in the clinical literature that yield desirable outcomes in terms of performance. So like, we're not putting in 4 to 6 grams of L-citrulline or 6 grams of citrulline malate and claiming this is the efficacious dose. Like, no, I'm putting in like fucking 9 to 10 grams of pure L-citrulline, not inflated with malic acid. I'm putting in ridiculously high dosages of each ingredient in each product in the exact synergy that yields the exact outcome I'm seeking, without cutting the costs and ensuring that the end product is the most potent version of that pre-workout on the market. The hybrid formula, Gorilla Mode, as well as Gorilla Mode Nitric, the stimulant-free formula, and Gorilla Mode Stim, the cost-effective Stim Junkie version of Gorilla Mode, essentially with all the pump products taken out of it. Every product we sell is top of the industry. Go compare our labels to the label of your current pre-workout. You can almost guarantee it shits on it. So if you want to support the brand and you haven't tried it out yet, video description below, there's a coupon code too for you to use for a bit of a discount. Realistically, it's already at reasonable prices based on the ingredient profile. So another 10% off is a steal, in my opinion. If you sourced all these ingredients separately, it would be far more expensive, and no pre-workout is touching these dosages or these combinations of ingredients. So check it out if you want to support me. Anything else I'm associated with, video description below. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.